The cleanest floors often reveal the truest hearts. Rain drummed steadily across the weathered roof of the small wooden cottage at the edge of the Northern Territory, while Claire Morgan guided a worn cotton mop across the freshly scrubbed pine floor with patient, practiced movements. Every board gleamed softly beneath the morning light filtering through the windows, carrying the warm scent of cedar and homemade bread cooling on the kitchen table. It was a simple home, but every corner reflected the quiet pride of the woman who cared for it alone. Claire believed that hard work deserved respect, no matter how small the task seemed. She had barely finished wiping away the final streak of water when the front door creaked open without warning. A tall stranger stepped inside, his dark traveling cloak dripping with rain. Thick layers of wet mud clung to his heavy leather boots, leaving large brown footprints across the spotless floor with every calm step he took. Claire froze for only a heartbeat before setting the mop aside and reaching for the old straw broom resting beside the doorway. She tightened her grip and marched directly toward the stranger with determined blue eyes that showed far more courage than fear. "Stop right there," she said firmly. "If you take one more step with those muddy boots, I will chase you right back outside with this broom." The stranger looked down at the muddy prints stretching behind him before lifting his eyes to meet hers. Instead of looking offended, he simply smiled with quiet amusement. His expression carried neither arrogance nor anger. It almost seemed as though he had expected someone to say those exact words. Claire pointed the broom toward the door. "I spent nearly 2 hours cleaning this floor. You are not ruining it because you forgot basic manners." For a brief moment, silence settled between them except for the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. Then, without saying a single word, the stranger slowly bent down, untied the leather straps around his boots, and carefully removed them. He placed both boots neatly beside the entrance before stepping onto the wooden floor, wearing only thick wool socks. "Better?" he asked with a gentle smile. Claire lowered the broom slightly, surprised by how quickly he had listened. She had expected an argument, an excuse, or at least an irritated complaint. Instead, he had quietly respected her request without hesitation. "Much better," she answered, although her cautious expression remained unchanged. "You may come in now." The traveler thanked her politely before warming his hands near the fireplace. Claire noticed that despite the expensive stitching hidden beneath his rain-soaked cloak, he carried himself without the pride often displayed by wealthy merchants or noblemen passing through the village. There was something calm about him, something observant. His sharp gray eyes wandered around the modest room, lingering on the carefully repaired furniture, the neatly folded blankets, and the simple family photographs resting upon a wooden shelf. "You keep this place beautiful," he said sincerely. Claire shrugged as she hung the damp mop to dry. "A home stays warm because someone chooses to care for it every single day." The stranger nodded thoughtfully, almost as if those ordinary words carried greater meaning than she realized. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant mountains while the rain continued falling over the vast forests surrounding the forgotten village. Hidden beneath the plain cloak of a weary traveler stood Nathan Ashford, the Alpha King himself, quietly beginning the journey that would change far more than either of them could possibly imagine. Nathan Ashford accepted the steaming mug of herbal tea with quiet gratitude while Claire Morgan returned the straw broom to its place beside the front door, still watching the unexpected traveler with careful attention. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and heavy drops continued striking the windows with steady determination. She placed a bowl of warm vegetable stew on the small wooden table before sitting across from him, leaving enough distance to remind herself that kindness did not require blind trust. Nathan noticed every detail inside the modest cottage. The curtains had been carefully stitched by hand after years of use. The rocking chair near the fireplace had been repaired more than once instead of replaced. Fresh wildflowers rested inside a simple glass jar on the windowsill, bringing quiet color into the humble room. Nothing spoke of wealth, yet everything reflected patience, discipline, and respect for honest work. Claire finally broke the silence. "You may stay until the storm passes, but I have rules." Nathan looked up with genuine curiosity. "I would like to hear them." She folded her hands together. Everyone who enters this house cleans up after themselves. Everyone helps if there is work to do. Everyone speaks honestly. If those rules sound difficult, there are other places to wait out the rain." Nathan smiled softly. "Those seem like fair rules." She gave a small nod before finishing her meal.
"Good.
Fairness keeps small places peaceful." Throughout the afternoon, Nathan quietly followed those simple expectations without complaint. When he noticed firewood stacked outside becoming soaked by the rain, he carried several dry logs into the cottage before Claire even asked. When he finished eating, he carefully washed his own bowl and placed it neatly beside the sink. Claire watched him from across the room with growing surprise. Most travelers expected hospitality without offering anything in return, especially men dressed in clothing that hinted at comfortable lives. This stranger behaved differently. Later that afternoon, a knock echoed against the front door. Claire immediately opened it to find her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harper, standing outside beneath a worn umbrella while struggling to balance a heavy basket filled with groceries. Without hesitation, Claire hurried into the rain, lifted the basket into her own arms, and guided the older woman safely inside. "You should not be carrying all of this by yourself," Claire said gently. Mrs. Harper smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I thought I could manage." Claire shook her head kindly. "You do not have to prove your strength every day." Nathan stood silently near the fireplace, pretending not to watch while carefully observing every exchange. Claire dried the older woman's coat, poured another mug of hot tea, and insisted she rest before walking home again. She never glanced toward Nathan to see whether he had noticed. She simply acted because someone needed help. As Mrs. Harper prepared to leave, she whispered with a grateful smile, "Your parents would be proud of the woman you have become." Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering softly, "I only hope I honor what they taught me." Nathan felt those quiet words remain with him long after the front door closed once more. He had traveled across countless villages searching for honesty beneath polished appearances, yet in a forgotten cottage at the edge of the Northern Territory, he was beginning to wonder whether the greatest strength he had ever encountered belonged to a woman who believed she was simply living an ordinary life. Morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky, and the rain finally faded into a cool mist that drifted gently across the surrounding forest. Claire Morgan stepped outside carrying an empty wicker basket while Nathan Ashford followed several steps behind after offering to help gather firewood before continuing his journey. Claire did not argue. She simply handed him another basket and reminded him with a calm smile that every guest who stayed beneath her roof earned breakfast by sharing the morning's work. Nathan accepted the task without hesitation, quietly amused that no one had ever assigned the Alpha King such ordinary responsibilities before. As they walked along the narrow woodland path, Claire greeted every neighbor they passed by name, never hurrying the conversations even when her own chores waited. Near the edge of the village, they found old Mr. Ellis struggling to lift several broken fence posts that had collapsed during the storm. Without waiting to be asked, Claire set down her basket and crossed the muddy ground. "Please let me help," she said gently. "You should not strain your back lifting these alone." Mr. Ellis smiled with grateful relief while Nathan silently picked up the remaining posts beside them. The elderly farmer looked between the two strangers and laughed warmly. "You make a good team." Claire simply smiled and continued working, paying little attention to the compliment. Once the fence stood upright again, Mr. Ellis offered Claire a few coins for her help. She politely shook her head. "Keep your money. I would rather know your fence will still be standing when the next storm comes." Nathan watched the exchange with growing admiration. No one else stood nearby to praise her. There was nothing for Claire to gain except the quiet satisfaction of leaving someone better than she had found them. They continued deeper into the village until they reached the small bakery, where the familiar smell of fresh bread drifted through the open doorway. Before Claire could enter, she noticed a young boy standing outside with his eyes fixed on the display of warm rolls resting behind the window. His clothes were clean but worn, and he quickly looked away when he realized someone had noticed him. Claire stepped inside the bakery and returned a moment later carrying 2 warm rolls wrapped in a cloth napkin. She handed one to the boy, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "A warm breakfast always makes the day seem a little brighter," she said softly. The boy hesitated before accepting it with both hands. "Thank you, Miss Claire." She smiled. "When you are older, help someone else the same way." Nathan remained several feet away, pretending to examine the market stalls while quietly observing every moment. Not once did Claire glance around to see whether anyone had witnessed her kindness. She never expected recognition because kindness had become part of who she was rather than something she performed. As they walked back toward the cottage with baskets now filled with split firewood and simple groceries, Nathan found himself questioning the purpose of the journey that had brought him there. He had left the royal castle searching for honesty beneath disguises, yet each passing hour revealed that the greatest disguise in the Northern Territory belonged to Claire herself. Behind the appearance of an ordinary village woman lived a strength of character that no royal title could ever create, and Nathan quietly realized that the more he observed her, the less ordinary she became. By the following morning, sunshine had finally broken through. The lingering clouds, washing the quiet village in warm golden light that made the rain-soaked fields sparkle. Nathan Ashford remained at Claire Morgan's cottage under the simple excuse that the roads farther north were still too muddy for safe travel. Claire accepted the explanation without suspicion. She believed every traveler deserved patience, but she expected each guest to contribute while staying beneath her roof. Nathan split another stack of firewood behind the cottage while Claire swept the front porch, carefully brushing away the last traces of dried mud left by yesterday's storm. As she worked, several villagers hurried down the narrow road, speaking with unusual excitement. "Have you heard?" one man called to another. "People say the Alpha King is traveling through the Northern Territory disguised as an ordinary man." Another woman quickly joined the conversation. "My cousin heard the royal guards have been searching every village. They say His Majesty wants to discover who people truly are when they think no one important is watching." Within hours, the rumor spread through every corner of the village. Shopkeepers suddenly greeted unfamiliar visitors with exaggerated smiles. Farmers who usually ignored strangers offered free apples and fresh milk to anyone wearing a decent cloak. Even children whispered that perhaps one of the travelers passing through might secretly be the Alpha King himself. Nathan quietly observed every change without revealing the slightest reaction. The difference was impossible to ignore. Kindness that had once appeared naturally now seemed carefully performed, as though everyone hoped an invisible audience might reward them. Claire noticed the strange behavior as well, although she simply continued with her daily routine. When one neighbor excitedly asked whether she believed the rumors, she answered with a small shrug. "If the Alpha King truly visits this village, I hope people treat him the same way they treat everyone else." The neighbor laughed nervously. "You would not try to chase him away with your broom again, would you?" Claire smiled without embarrassment. "If he walked across my clean floor wearing muddy boots?" "Absolutely. A king can remove his boots just as easily as anyone else." Nathan nearly smiled behind the basket he was carrying, but he lowered his eyes before anyone noticed. Later that afternoon, they stopped at the general store to purchase flour and lamp oil. The owner immediately greeted Nathan with remarkable enthusiasm, offering generous discounts and insisting he accept extra supplies without charge. Nathan politely declined every offer. The moment another poorly dressed traveler entered behind him, the cheerful welcome disappeared. The shopkeeper answered with short, impatient words before returning to his work. Nathan watched the sudden change in silence. Claire noticed it as well. She quietly picked up an additional loaf of bread, paid for it herself, and slipped it into the weary traveler's hands before leaving the store. She never criticized the shopkeeper. She never made a speech. She simply corrected a small injustice in the only way she believed mattered. As they walked home beneath the gentle afternoon sun, Nathan found himself thinking less about the rumors filling the village and more about the woman walking beside him. Everyone else had changed because of a story they had heard. Claire had not changed at all. She remained honest when honesty was inconvenient, fair when fairness brought no reward, and unwavering in the quiet principles that guided every ordinary moment of her life. Nathan had begun this journey searching for truth beneath disguises, yet with every passing hour, he realized that Claire Morgan had never worn one. The The following morning brought clear blue skies, but the dirt roads surrounding the village remained thick with deep patches of mud left behind by the storm. Claire Morgan carried a basket filled with fresh bread and homemade preserves toward the market while Nathan Ashford walked beside her, still playing the role of an ordinary traveler grateful for her hospitality. The peaceful rhythm of the morning suddenly changed when the sound of anxious voices echoed from farther down the road. A large wooden carriage had slipped into a deep rut where the rain had softened the ground, leaving one wheel buried nearly halfway beneath the muddy earth. Several finely dressed passengers stood nearby, clearly frustrated as they argued with one another while the exhausted driver struggled to calm the horses. Villagers gathered at a distance, whispering among themselves. Some recognized the elegant crest painted upon the carriage door and assumed the passengers must be wealthy nobles traveling through the Northern Territory. Others hesitated, unwilling to dirty their clothes helping strangers who appeared important enough to solve their own problems. Claire never paused to consider who occupied the carriage. She quietly set her basket beneath a nearby oak tree, rolled up the sleeves of her simple dress, and walked directly toward the driver. "Do not worry about the wheel," she said with calm confidence. "Let us make certain everyone is safe first." She offered one elderly passenger her hand while helping her step carefully across the slippery ground. She guided a young servant carrying several heavy travel bags away from the unstable carriage before asking whether anyone had been injured. Only after everyone stood safely upon solid ground did she turn her attention toward the buried wheel. Nathan watched every movement without interfering. The members of the royal council sitting inside the carriage had traveled with him many times before, although none of them recognized their own Alpha King beneath his plain cloak. They also did not recognize the village woman who now directed everyone with quiet confidence despite wearing no badge of authority. Claire gathered several nearby villagers with gentle encouragement instead of commands. "If we place flat stones beneath the wheel and push together when the horses move slowly, the carriage should come free without damaging the axle." Her steady voice removed the tension that had filled the road only moments earlier. Nathan stepped forward beside the others, placing both hands against the wooden frame as though he were simply another volunteer. At Claire's signal, everyone pushed together. The horses leaned forward, the wheel climbed onto the stones, and the carriage rolled free with a heavy but satisfying movement. Relief spread across every face. One distinguished gentleman climbed down from the carriage and reached into his coat, offering Claire a small leather pouch filled with silver coins. She smiled politely before taking one careful step backward. "Please keep your money," she said. "Neighbors help one another because it is the right thing to do, not because someone can afford to pay." The gentleman studied her with genuine surprise before respectfully returning the pouch to his pocket. Nathan quietly noticed several council members exchanging thoughtful glances, clearly impressed by the woman who had refused a generous reward without hesitation. As Claire retrieved her basket and continued toward the market as though nothing remarkable had happened, Nathan remained standing beside the now-freed carriage for a brief moment. He realized the greatest test had never belonged to the stranded travelers. It had belonged to the woman who never asked whether kindness was deserved before choosing to offer it, and once again she had passed without ever realizing she had been observed. The village had barely settled after the excitement surrounding the stranded carriage when another unexpected visitor arrived just before sunset. A royal messenger wearing the silver crest of the Northern Kingdom rode into the square and stopped before Claire Morgan's cottage. Curious neighbors slowly gathered along the roadside, exchanging uneasy whispers while the messenger climbed down from his horse, carrying a sealed parchment marked with the royal insignia. Claire stepped outside with calm composure, wiping flour from her hands after preparing bread for the following morning. The messenger bowed respectfully before extending the invitation. "By order of the Royal Council, Claire Morgan is requested to appear at Ashford Castle in 3 days." The quiet street instantly fell silent. Claire accepted the parchment with both hands before carefully breaking the seal. Her expression remained steady as she read each line, but the villagers surrounding her quickly began inventing explanations long before she finished. "It has to be because of the traveler," someone whispered. "She threatened him with a broom the moment he entered her house." Another voice answered nervously, What if that traveler truly was the Alpha King? The rumor spread through the crowd almost immediately, growing larger with every retelling. Claire folded the letter and slipped it into her apron pocket without showing fear. "The invitation does not accuse me of anything," she said quietly. "It simply asks me to appear before the council." Mrs. Harper stepped forward with worried eyes. "You should not go alone." Claire offered her reassuring smile. "If I have done nothing dishonest, then I have nothing to fear." Standing only a few yards away, Nathan Ashford listened in thoughtful silence. Hidden beneath the plain clothing of an ordinary traveler, he watched Claire respond exactly as he had begun expecting. She did not search for excuses. She did not blame anyone. She simply accepted responsibility for facing whatever waited ahead. Early the next morning, Nathan announced that it was finally time for him to continue his own journey. Claire packed fresh bread, dried apples, and a small bundle of smoked meat before placing everything into a simple cloth bag. "The roads are still rough in places," she said. "You may not find another meal until evening." Nathan accepted the bundle with genuine gratitude. "You have shown remarkable generosity to someone you barely know." Claire smiled softly. Hospitality is easier when people remember they could one day become the traveler standing at someone else's door. Nathan held her words quietly within his thoughts before reaching into his pocket. He removed a small silver coin and placed it carefully upon the kitchen table. Claire immediately pushed it back toward him. "You have already earned your stay by helping around the house." Nathan looked at her with calm respect. "Then keep it as payment for the food." Claire gently shook her head. "Safe travels are thanks enough." Nathan did not argue again. Instead, he slipped the coin back into his pocket and offered a slight bow that carried far greater respect than any ordinary farewell. As he walked down the narrow road leading away from the cottage, he glanced back one final time. Claire had already returned to sweeping her front porch exactly as she had the morning they first met. Nothing about the royal invitation had changed her routine, her humility, or her quiet determination. Nathan smiled to himself as the castle appeared faintly beyond the distant hills. In only a few days, the woman who had once threatened a muddy traveler with a broom would stand inside the royal court without realizing that the greatest secret in the kingdom had been sitting beside her fireplace all along. 3 days later, Claire Morgan stood quietly at the foot of the wide marble staircase leading into Ashford Castle, her simple traveling dress standing in sharp contrast to the elegant clothing worn by nobles and distinguished guests arriving from every corner of the kingdom. She ignored the curious glances that followed her through the grand entrance and calmly presented the royal invitation to the guards. One of them respectfully nodded before escorting her into the magnificent throne hall where members of the royal council had already gathered beneath towering banners bearing the silver wolf crest of the Ashford family. Claire had never seen such a magnificent room. Sunlight poured through enormous stained glass windows, reflecting across polished stone floors that seemed almost too beautiful to walk upon. Even so, she held her head high, reminding herself that honesty did not become smaller simply because the room became larger. Quiet conversations drifted through the hall until the sound of ceremonial trumpets echoed across the chamber. Every noble immediately turned toward the great doors as the captain of the royal guard announced with unwavering authority, His Majesty, Alpha King Nathan Ashford. Claire instinctively lowered her eyes along with everyone else as the doors slowly opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the silent hall before stopping before the royal throne. Only when the captain invited everyone to rise did Claire finally lift her gaze. The moment her eyes met the man seated upon the throne, every thought inside her seemed to disappear. The traveler who had carried muddy boots into her spotless cottage now wore the royal cloak of the Alpha King. The calm gray eyes were the same. The gentle smile was the same. Only the truth had changed. Claire remained perfectly still, struggling to reconcile the ordinary guest she had welcomed into her home with the ruler now watching over an entire kingdom. Soft whispers swept across the assembled crowd as many noticed the surprise upon her face. Several council members exchanged knowing smiles, already aware of the remarkable encounter that had taken place days earlier. Nathan rose from the throne and slowly descended the steps with steady confidence until only a few feet separated him from Claire. There was no trace of anger in his expression. Instead, his eyes reflected the same quiet warmth she remembered from the morning he had removed his boots without protest. "Claire Morgan," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the silent hall. "Do you recognize me?" Claire drew a slow breath before answering honestly. "Yes, Your Majesty. I recognize the traveler who respected my home before I recognized my king." Nathan smiled gently, clearly pleased by her answer. He turned toward the gathered nobles and members of the royal council. "Many of you have heard rumors about a woman who threatened an unknown traveler with a broom because he carried mud across her clean floor." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the hall. Nathan raised one hand, and the room immediately became silent once again. "Everything you have heard is true," he continued. "She believed I was an ordinary stranger, and she demanded that I respect the work she had spent hours completing." Claire lowered her eyes briefly, uncertain what would come next, while the entire court waited for the Alpha King's judgment. Nathan looked toward her once more, his voice steady and unmistakably sincere. "Today, every person in this hall deserves to know why that simple moment became one of the most important lessons I have learned since wearing this crown." The great hall remained completely silent as Nathan Ashford slowly turned to face the members of the royal council, the assembled nobles, and the honored guests who had traveled from every corner of the kingdom. His voice carried calm authority, yet every word reflected quiet sincerity, rather than pride. "When I left this castle several days ago, I did not travel north searching for comfort or admiration. I traveled to discover whether people still treated strangers with dignity when they believed those strangers had nothing to offer in return." His eyes briefly met Claire Morgan's before returning to the crowd. "The first door I entered belonged to this woman." A respectful silence settled across the chamber. Nathan continued, "I stepped inside wearing muddy boots after a long journey through heavy rain. Claire did not recognize a king. She did not recognize wealth. She saw only someone about to destroy 2 hours of honest work." Gentle smiles appeared among several council members. Nathan's own expression softened as he remembered that simple morning. "She raised a broom and warned me that if I took another step, she would send me back outside." Some may believe that sounds disrespectful. I believe it was one of the most honest moments I have experienced in many years. Quiet laughter spread through the hall before fading once again. Nathan lifted one hand toward Claire. She was protecting the home she had built through discipline, sacrifice, and effort. Respect for another person's labor is never disrespectful. He slowly descended the final steps until he stood beside Claire once again. "I removed my boots that day, not because I feared the broom, but because I respected the woman holding it." Those words echoed through the chamber, leaving many listeners visibly moved. Nathan then turned back toward the royal council. "During the days that followed, I remained in her home disguised as an ordinary traveler. I watched her help an elderly neighbor carry groceries without expecting thanks. I watched her repair a broken fence for a farmer who could not repay her. I watched her buy bread for a hungry child without announcing her kindness to anyone. I watched her refuse silver after freeing a stranded carriage because she believed helping others should never depend upon payment." Several council members quietly nodded, recognizing the very carriage they themselves had occupied. One elderly counselor stepped forward and bowed respectfully toward
Claire.
"Every word His Majesty has spoken is true. We witnessed her integrity with our own eyes." Nathan allowed the moment to settle before speaking again. Many people become generous when they believe a king is watching. Claire remained exactly the same before she knew anyone important had entered her life. That kind of character cannot be purchased, borrowed, or taught through titles. It already exists within the heart. Claire lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by praise she had never imagined receiving. Nathan looked toward her with genuine admiration. "Claire Morgan, you believed you were simply offering shelter to a weary traveler. In truth, you reminded your king that humility deserves as much honor as courage, and that the strongest foundations of a kingdom are built inside ordinary homes where honesty is practiced every single day." The throne hall remained silent once more, But this time the silence carried not uncertainty, but deep respect for the woman whose greatest act had simply been choosing to remain herself. For several quiet moments, no one inside the throne hall spoke. Then, one by one, members of the royal council rose from their seats, followed by the visiting nobles, respected elders, and royal officials, not because tradition demanded it, but because genuine respect had replaced every assumption they had once carried. Claire Morgan looked around the magnificent chamber with quiet disbelief, wondering how an ordinary woman from a small village had become the center of attention inside the greatest castle in the kingdom. Nathan Ashford stepped closer and offered her a warm smile that reminded her far more of the humble traveler than the powerful Alpha King seated upon the throne only moments before. "Claire," he said gently, "I did not ask you to come here so that this court could praise you. I asked you to come because every kingdom needs people whose character remains unchanged whether they stand inside a cottage or a castle." Claire slowly lifted her eyes. "Your Majesty, I do not know anything about serving inside a royal court." Nathan nodded as though he had expected that answer. "Perhaps not, but you understand something far more valuable. You understand how to treat people before you know who they are." A quiet smile appeared across several faces throughout the hall. Nathan continued, "Titles can command obedience. Wealth can purchase comfort. Power can create order. But none of those things can create trust. Trust begins when people know they will receive the same kindness, whether they are welcomed as kings or as strangers." Claire remained silent, carefully considering every word before answering with the same honesty that had guided her from the beginning. "If I accepted any responsibility here, I would still tell muddy travelers to leave their boots by the door." Soft laughter gently filled the chamber once again. Nathan laughed with everyone else before replying, "Then I would expect every guest in this castle, including myself, to do exactly that." Even the senior council members smiled at the unexpected exchange. The atmosphere that had once been formal now felt unexpectedly warm, as though the distance between the throne and the ordinary people of the kingdom had quietly become smaller. Nathan then addressed the entire court. "Beginning today, I am establishing a new council dedicated to listening directly to the concerns of villages throughout our lands. I would like Claire Morgan to serve as its first community advisor, not because of noble birth, but because she has demonstrated wisdom that cannot be inherited." The invitation surprised everyone, especially Claire herself. She lowered her head respectfully before speaking. "I cannot promise that I will always have the perfect answer." Nathan answered without hesitation. "Neither can I. That is why honest voices are so important." Claire accepted with quiet humility, understanding that the position was not a reward for one unusual encounter, but an opportunity to continue serving others exactly as she always had. As sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, Nathan looked toward the distant mountains beyond the castle walls and reflected upon the journey that had begun with muddy boots outside a simple cottage. He had set out searching for loyal subjects and returned having found something far greater. He had discovered that the strongest hearts often lived far from royal halls, hidden inside ordinary homes where dignity was protected, kindness was given freely, and respect was never reserved only for those wearing crowns. From that day forward, every traveler who entered Ashford Castle found a simple wooden bench beside the entrance with a small sign carved into polished oak that read, "Please leave your muddy boots here." Every clean floor deserves respect. Those who knew the story always smiled, because they understood that one ordinary woman had quietly reminded an entire kingdom that true greatness always begins with humility.